Thank you for bearing with me. I suspect this presentation is going to be very different from what you might expect. I come to this conference from a little bit of a different perspective, but a perspective that I think is extremely valuable because it is different, and I think that will be borne out. The purpose of my presentation today is, I think, to introduce a couple of questions to start a conversation. And that conversation is around two topics. One is humanity's role in helping sustain the deep interconnectivity, intense network conversation, and highly coordinated action among massive numbers of diverse agents needed for complex adaptive systems to fully function. The second is the role of complexity, informatics, cybernetics within this current situation where we need to re-empower complex adaptive systems to be able to use low energy photons of light to recreate and regenerate the complexity that we depend upon being there every day to function. And of course, then how not only humanity plugs into that complexity, but also all intelligent systems, all intelligences, how they can connect into that. So, as I talk, I'm going to begin by introducing three or four terms. The first is most important, and that's what I mean in this presentation when I talk about positive and when I talk about negative. And I have a very qualitative, kind of common person definition. Positive means system change, performance, stabilities are actually sustained or enhanced. So positive is good for the system. Negative is that system change is toward decreased productivity, et cetera. Now, I've spoken a lot at systems conferences, and from a systems use of those terms, it's exactly backwards. From a systems use of terms, positive means positive feedback loops, which tend to send systems into boom and bust cycles. From a cybernetic sense, positive tends to mean you're adding numerically to inputs, et cetera. So a different use of the term. I use the terms the way I do because I think it's important to be able to speak to the broadest group of people as possible. I started years ago when I spoke in general systems conferences, using a terminology that I thought was comfortable to broad audiences and just trying to be very careful about introducing the terms and how I use them. Complex adaptive systems is also an important term in my presentation because I come to this conference from a perspective of complexity, but it may be a different definition of complexity than the ones that you may or may not use. In a complex adaptive system, they're systems whose parts interact and co-adapt to produce complex behavior. So they're regenerative systems. They're complex adaptive or co-adaptive systems. And then the last term I'll probably use in the presentation is appreciative system, which is a term I was introduced back in the 90s, early 90s. An appreciative system is one that fully participates in the complexity that it helps create. And so the presentation is titled A Big History. You all know Big History. You've seen Big History. There's some wonderful Big History TED Talks where in 20 minutes you get the big history of the universe from the Big Bang to present day. I decided about 10 years ago to start structuring a lot of my research and my discussions from this big history perspective. Read an interesting book called The Journey of the Universe, Swime and Tucker, that actually talked about, in the history of the universe, 3 major transformations. The first was the physical transformation of the universe, which continues to this day. You still have spiral galaxies that are spinning off and planets are forming, and that physical complexification is a regenerative process that goes on today. The second major transformation, which is even more important, I think, in this conversation, is the ecological complexification of planet Earth. And that's where living systems complexified and profoundly increased the productivity, the capability of production on planet Earth. The book also talked about a third transformation as being an ongoing transformation, where some people would say hour one, other people would say further, but we're in this transformation of the next system. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So let's step back and look at that second transformation, because that's the one that really frames my talk today. And that's ecological complexity. And I teach, among the courses I teach in landscape architecture. And I love to start my introduction to speaking to landscape architects with this, asking them to appreciate the complexity that we were given, that humanity was given. And that's the complexity that it takes to take low energy photons of light and to use that low energy to transform a gray orbit, planet Earth, into the ecological richness and diversity and biocapacity of planet Earth today. That's only done through unbelievable amount of complexity of communication, of coevolution or co-adaption of elements in the system. So how do complex adaptive systems work? And at all 3 of those transformations, whether you're talking about physical, biological, or cognitive, they tend to work through cycles of innovation and co-adaption. And complexity tends to emerge through those cycles within some dynamic tension. You might think of it as a duality. For instance, in the physical universe, that complexification, it was the Big Bang expansion and gravitational coalescing. So it's that dynamic tension between a system that's driven both by expansion and contraction. The second, biological or ecological, tended to be individual agents, animals, plants, would innovate, and then they would die. And depending upon whether the system was able, or the species was able to adapt, then they would be sustained. So that system tended to be this dynamic tension between individual innovation and species co-adaption that carried that innovation forward into the future. This third emerging transformation, for about the last 20 years, I've been looking at it as driven by the internal tension within the human body, within the human spirit. A tension between, I want to be individually successful, and I really do want to be part of something that's bigger than I am. And whether I've looked at things like spiral dynamics and integral theory and those various things that really deal with how these 2 competing forces tends to change and cause people and cultures to establish, as we talked about yesterday, different worldviews. seeing the world profoundly different one from another. As a result of our discussions yesterday, I'm beginning to think about, that duality, or certainly another important duality, is that duality of logical and analogical thinking, which certainly applies to this conference and to what most of you do. So continuing in terms of complexity emerging through cycles of innovation and co-adaption, if you look at that vertical, or you could take that vertical tube there and see it as the dough of a donut. Imagine it closing upon itself. That dough, or those cycles within that zone, is what keeps the system fully regenerating, healthy. And so I talk about it in terms of this multiple, immense numbers of cycles of innovation and co-adaption within a zone. Kate Rayworth talks about living in the donut, or talks about living in a safe and just world. In her view, she makes a donut out of it. In the middle, you have satisfying all the needs of humanity, and on the outside of it, you have planetary systems being exceeded, and the challenge is to live within that donut. So she would say live within the donut, I say live within the system. Throughout most of history, humanity lived within the system. They lived within that bounded relationship. And then we got smart enough. And that smart enough is where we really started, I think, to make major progress in this third transformation. Because we got smart enough to live outside of the system. And we did it by doing things like externalizing impacts. I don't have to deal with them because they happen somewhere else, some other time. Our grandkids will deal with them. We ceased to feel the need to live within the complex adaptive system that we were dependent upon. And so the end result of that was that we've now left that zone, safe and just zone of humanity, and we're now, the impacts of growth and of externalizing those impacts is now exceeding global regenerative capacity. So the Earth can no longer keep up with what we're asking it to do. Now this is a kind of an abstract from a diagram that I've seen before, but what it basically talks about is that in the U.S., and somewhere in the late 60s or early 70s, we actually succeeded in transforming the nation as a regenerative force into being a degenerating force. So our impacts exceeded the ability of the system to regenerate biocapacity, so we became a degenerating rather than a regenerating system. In fact, I heard Howard Odum talking about this in the early 70s and showing a similar kind of a thing. And in the past 10 years that I've been doing this lecture, how far we're outside went from 1.2 Earths in terms of how much impact we create to 1.5 to now 1.6. So not only are we living outside of the system, but the degree to which we're living outside is rapidly increasing. So I see the 21st century challenge, which is a huge challenge, which has to do with addressing how do we deal with complex adaptive system that we're totally dependent upon at a time that those systems are in escalating decline. That's the challenge we have facing us. So they're degrading from self-managing, self-regulating, totally healthily regenerating their capacity into systems that fail to regenerate. They're operating, and we're operating outside of their dynamic equilibrium. We're experiencing, as a result, unthinkable change. How many of you have read the book Age of the Unthinkable? Ramo's book talks about how more and more we're discovering that the major problems that we have to face, the unthinkable problems we have to face, are the ones that we've actually created. So we've produced the age of the unthinkable: climate change, collapsing populations, global war. These are problems that humanity has created by not living within this safe and just world. And finally, this multitude of crises, environmental, social, economic, whatever, when all systems tend to be moving into crises, it really says that the problems we're looking at aren't the problems. They're the symptoms, and the problem really has to do with something much deeper than that. My contention is, and has been for several decades, that underlying meta-problem is the fact that we're not living within the dynamics that we must depend upon for survival. A good friend of mine, David Armistead in Austin, Texas, talks about what happens when we actually figure out how to live in systems. The way he says it is, it's going to be the mother of all economies. Because if you think about what we produce in a complex adaptive system that we are dragging down and slowly starving or killing or whatever, and instead envision a system where we are co-designing and fully collaborating in building the complexity and regeneration back into the system, how much more of an economic and productive potential will that have? So now humanity has lived, really I've talked about it in terms of three traditions of development. The first was indigenous, local communities, where they innovated and co-adapted within complexity, and if they couldn't within local complexity, they suffered or they moved on, passed away, or relocated, or whatever. The second tradition, and Throwing Rocks at the Google Bus talks about this tradition in great detail, of how over the last 800 years we've gone from the Dark Ages, from feudal cultures, all the way through a series of curves, bell curves, of increased consumption, increased impacts, and never figuring out how to sustain it. The third tradition, which is where we are now, trying to learn how humanity can become an appreciative system and become a system that survives indefinitely into the future. So this third transformation is all about cognitive complexification, getting complex enough in the way we deal with complexity that we don't shut it down, that we rather unlock it. The Center, Sustainable Communities Institute, which I helped create and now serve as their educational consultant, is a think and do institute. It's all about helping communities learn to live within systems, about education, research, demonstration. It's about collaboration, which is what hopefully I'm doing here, because I hope we start conversations that continue into the future, and about integrating energy, water, and food systems, or what's now being called the energy, water, food nexus, to optimize how much we can produce within the basic capacity of the systems we live in. In terms of sustainability, we usually look at ecological, social, and economic systems. I started about 8 or 9 years ago trying to understand the true relationship of those. And nowadays you hear people talk about environmental capital or environmental services. I take a kind of an inter-system approach of services. Not, environmental services to me is a parasitic word. What service does the environment provide to humanity? Well, my question, or to the economy, my question is, in addition, what services does the economy provide to ecology? And between economy and society, and between society and environment. And at the point that we have closed loop flows in all three of those sets, then we're actually living in systems, which is what our institute tries to do. It tries to move cultures and move communities from this throughput system that we're in now of taking resources, flowing them through and making waste out of them, to dealing with all key resources, energy, water, food, materials, as closed loop, life cycle, regenerative, cyclical flows, circular flows of resources. I've over the course of this conference so far here, I've also been a little bit surprised about the degree to which we're discipline-based in our thinking. Even when we talk about becoming more collaborative or spreading our vision, it's stated in terms of interdisciplinary, not in terms of diverse intelligences. And interdisciplinary, you come to that through the discipline door. A whole system education has no need for interdisciplinarity because people make whole system decisions. So that discipline-based way of seeing, a science-based way of seeing, to me are both wonderful and extremely important. But what about indigenous knowledge? What about vernacular knowledge? As an academician, I'm really good about dealing with things in a theoretical sense. I'm not nearly as good about getting things done in the messy world out there. So all of these, to actually affect positive change that's embraced by the larger culture, really requires bringing all of these to the table. In terms of communities, it has to do with interconnecting three levels of human supports. One is that ecological system that we're totally dependent upon. The second is the infrastructural systems. And in my case, you know, in a town, a city, whatever, we may be talking about transportation, we may be talking about water, energy, whatever. It's also technology as systems. How do we provision the world with technological systems that, in fact, make the world around us, make the complex system healthier and more productive? And then how do we build environments like smart cities, et cetera? How do we build those environments such that we resource the resources and regenerate the resources that we're dependent upon? Also, as moving toward this conference, I began thinking a lot more about human intelligence and artificial intelligence and how rapidly those are changing. What about the thinking mode? I mean, we talked yesterday a lot about humans tend to be analogical thinkers, computers tend to be logical thinkers, and our ability to think logically through mathematics is rapidly advancing because of IT. I'm not sure that our ability to think analogically is that we're paying enough attention to it, as Najib said the other day when we were talking. Part of this merging is focusing the human intelligence focusing on whole systems and whole system understanding. The computer, for instance, uses mathematical logic. The human mind uses everything from emotional thinking to rational thinking to spiritual thinking to love and caring, and all of these are intelligences in our mind, and the real power of the mind is being able to make synthesizing decisions from all of those different knowledge systems. In terms of collective decisions, 20 years ago, I had the great fortune of being involved in physical planning and design processes that were innovation intervention processes, where you'd get diverse awarenesses, diverse intelligences around the table, and the only operating rule was no one was an expert on anything. And so you made collective whole systems decision through a consciousness that didn't allow any expert to shut down the breadth of thinking about those issues. So in some sense, that was a human, perhaps human intelligence corollary to the current kind of swarm behaviors in technology, where you get a lot of intelligent agents, each coming at it a little different, and you're trying to optimize the best decision. How might the performance measure change. For instance, there's a lot going on now in how people are making community-informed decisions in a way that builds trust as the metric of whether they've performed well. And someone yesterday was talking about blockchains as being a metric that records the success of decisions or decisions made in the past. So computers have their way of recording performance, and human communities have their way. And then this co-adapted intelligence, which is what I was speaking about yesterday, complex system co-design. And I actually yesterday talked about 5 different generations of how physical planning and design has changed from the expert-driven designer all the way to this 5th generation. 4th generation, which is where we are now, tends to be, people are calling it co-design. So I don't design for a community, I work with a community, and the collaborative of myself as designer and the community is what co-designs it. And I look at that and I go, yeah, but that's anthropocentric design. That's not complex system. So then 5th generation is, how do you do a complexity-centric co-design, which I refer to as complex system co-design. And how the design science, the designer doing complex system co-design innovates into complexity, and how complexity science as this innovation co-adaption cycle, how you design or innovate into complexity, and how do you get feedback from complexity, and therefore how do you learn better how to design into complexity, and therefore get better feedback from complexity. So seeing the challenge, whether you're a designer or someone in cybernetics or someone in informatics, if we're really getting to a sustainable future, and many people say we've got about 30 years to do it, then it becomes crucial of how does the process figure out how to deal with these diversities of thinking in such a way that you build a richness into the complexity. Now, as I talked and thought about this talk, I actually thought about 3 different levels or orders of complexity. And I know that people have talked about 3rd generation cybernetics in a very different way, but I use that term from my big history perspective. 1st generation cybernetics is when complex systems figured out how to control and manage and regenerate themselves. Second order cybernetics is when living systems did the same thing. I see the 3rd order of cybernetics is when conscious thinking, and that's both the human mind and all of the other intelligences like artificial intelligence that we pull into that, becomes complex and interconnected and deep enough in its interconnected behavior and co-adaption that it sustains the full capacity productivity of systems. So I'm kind of running along on time with the time getting set up. I have been thinking during this conference, musing, not yet predictions or speculations even, but just musings about big history and co-design. Is it co-design or co-management? Does cybernetics shift or move into some kind of a co-management paradigm from a control paradigm? Or even if you're in a control paradigm, I don't know. But in this 3rd order cybernetics, what is the paradigm of informatics and cybernetics? Second, in this shift, what's the role of 3rd order cybernetics in this co-design of shift of humanity to become an appreciative system, of co-designing the integration of the Internet of Things, smart assets, self-organizing software, and the circular economy. And by the way, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation is kind of focused there. And then how do we co-manage actions to optimize, sustain, and the productive potential of our energy, water, and food nexus, which is seen as the primary interconnected resources that, unless we can sustain and fully regenerate all 3 of those, we can't survive. And then all of this I kind of are throwing into this one category that I've been talking about for about the last 3 years, which is all about unlocking complexity, which is, I think, the best definition of that challenge of the 21st century is we've got to figure out how to unlock complexity, allow systems that complexify on their own accord to be able to do that, and specifically, what's the role that we have in that happening. I think this is the next to the last slide I have. It looks at the previous view and the emerging view. So previously we thought the need for systems was to control them. Now it's to co-design them. The view of wealth was shift from its accumulating financial capital to its true wealth building of all of the capitals, everything social, political, economic, trust, all of those. Shift from an economy waste to resource to waste economy to a metabolic closed loop circular economy. Changing the nature of transactions from fees provided for, or fees paid for services to transactions being all about satisfying needs within sustainable capacity of the complex adaptive system, et cetera. So looking at these various dimensions and how they're in the process of changing, which to me is those changes that I, as a designer who likes to focus on innovation, and people in the room that are the experts in how do you actually operationalize to affect those kind of change so the systems can actually produce that. And then my last working slide is basically back to that first slide. It talks about looking forward and really how do we move forward? How do we take this conversation forward? Because what always happens is we have a conversation and then we leave. So on both these questions, I'm here basically to start a conversation, and I'm committed to sustaining a conversation. So I'm hoping that you take that email address, you take the information from my paper, from this presentation, and that we look for opportunities to collaborate between design science and complexity science so as to be able to co-design a sustainable and regenerative future. With that, I think I'm complete.